Welcome back to From the Belly. I'm Doug Wheeler. I'm the owner and operator of this small but powerful podcast. And it's really all about the guests that I have. The majority of people, as I've mentioned in other episodes, I meet them. I meet them on Facebook. I reach out to them. I cold call them, be it cold email them. And I've got a pretty good record of people getting back to me. And I was thinking I was just going to go with that this morning. Like, well, that's how I met my guest that's going to show up here in a minute, Reverend Dr. Rodney Kennedy, and I'm going to refer to him as Rod. He gave me permission to do so. But that's not how we met. I was turned on to one of his articles out of the Baptist, what is it, Rod? The Baptist Global?
Baptist News Global.
There we go, Baptist News Global. And I reached out to Rod, and I thought, and I looked at his library or archived articles. You've been writing for them for a while. I thought, well, I'll probably never, nothing against Rod because I've never met him, but I thought I'll never hear back from him. I mean, he's got bigger fish to fry. And man, I tell you, within 24 hours, Rod responded and said, yeah, I'd love to talk to you. And so we had a great connection last week. We talked for, close to an hour. We're both from the South. And so there's some, I don't know, there's just something about that connection, but it goes deeper than that. And then I learned this morning, and Rod will tell us what's on his shirt, but he's a Flannery O'Connor fan. How did you put that, Rod, that you keep her close to you? For what purpose?
I always try to stand close to Flannery O'Connor anytime I really need to show people I'm taking my Christianity seriously, because this woman was a serious believer.
And I said to you when I should, why don't you want to stand up and we'll see your shirt, Rod? You cool with that? What does your shirt say? The truth does not change according to our ability to stomach it. Wow. And I had just mentioned I know about Flannery and read her, not all her work, but didn't live long on this earth, man. But in the suffering that woman went through, but the light that came through, what came through and what came out of her. If you don't believe in a miracle, read Flannery O'Connor and then read her story and see what she went through. And you'll say that you've witnessed a miracle that could come out of somebody that suffered that much. Let me read a bit of Rod's bio. We do that here on From the Belly. And by the way, this is the 20th episode. And if you count things, you'll notice that this is actually the 19th episode that's been being aired. There's one that's still being edited. It's still getting worked on. I got somebody else working on it because they're a family member of the person that I interviewed, and they wanted to work on it. So I said, go for it. So that's in the back room, if you will, and that's going to come out. We've done 20 episodes in this new series of Why Not Church, or maybe Why Church? And it probably doesn't need me to go any further than that, but I like to talk, so I'll say a few more things about it. The way I came to that was I would imagine having a conversation with a neighbor or somebody here in town, and somehow they find out that I tell them I go to First Baptist Church here in McMinnville, and I proudly go here. And I would imagine that maybe after we got to talking and they've had some church experience, and gosh, Rod's going to tell us about his church experience. He's been doing this work for a long, long time. And I would say, well, why not church? In regards to maybe come and visit, or why not church? And the person, I would be prepared for most people to say, well, why church? Either because it's irrelevant, or they've got church hurt, or it's just like, I don't know what you folks do behind those doors, but it doesn't really affect my life or the world at all. And I think that's a great place to start, to set the table for Rod to say a few things. But I always get ahead of myself. Let me say, on Rod's website, which is Progressive Pastor.
No, theprogressivepreacher.com.
Preacher. There it is.
Theprogressivepreacher.com.
There we go. It says, welcome, welcome, welcome. This is in Rod's words. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I'm Rodney Kennedy. I'm a progressive Christian and political dissident. I preach prophetically, politically, personally for you. I say what many pastors can't say from the pulpit. And then quickly, Rod is a progressive Christian pastor. He's a writer and speaker. He's written 12 books. He's currently working on 2 preaching books, Preaching in Doxology and Preaching Politically. He is a politically involved preacher, dissenting from the politics of President Donald Trump. And I'll let you take it from there.
Doug, I want to thank you for the opportunity to talk to you. I had a great time talking when we introduced ourselves to each other. The passion of my heart is to get the voice of progressive Christians out there in our culture. It doesn't have to be my voice. I am an encourager of all the progressive preachers in this country. But I think progressives have allowed the evangelical fundamentalist Christians to dominate the media. They not only own 85% of all public media with their satellites and their TV ministries, but they are on more than 2,100 Christian radio stations. And they even have their own spokesperson on Fox News, the Reverend Dr. Robert Jeffers, the pastor of the First Baptist Church in Dallas, Texas. They're everywhere. And there are powerful progressive voices, but where are they? They're not being heard. They're not being invited. And sometimes the more you speak as a progressive Christian, the fewer invitations you will receive. But that's no excuse for stopping. I am a dissenter par excellence, and I will continue to dissent as long as I have a breath in my body. It is important that the progressive message be heard. And my purpose is to do everything possible to spread that word to as many people as possible. I will speak anywhere, go anywhere, write as much as I can write, preach as often as I can preach, if I will have the opportunity to say the progressive Christian message is the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's how I feel. It's what's on my heart right now today.
Has that always been on your heart, Rod?
For about the last 20 years, but even more specifically, since the dawn of the age of Donald Trump, and since the age of what we now refer to as post-truth, which is an age where people value something they call freedom more than they value the truth. And the longer I have tried to deal with that, the more passionate I have become about insisting that this is just the incarnation of pure evil, and it has to be stopped.
What is evil about it, Rod?
So it takes the evangelical faith, which had a great beginning, by the way. It's a word that means good news. An evangelical faith that's spread throughout the United States from the moment that we entered these shores. And it has perverted it into a secular political doctrine whose only concern now is with winning. And the reason they want to win is because they want to control. And that means they're trampling on the separation of church and state, on the First Amendment, on the rights of human beings to dissent from everything that they believe is the truth. And I cannot, in a clear conscience, call this anything other than evil. When you combine a religious organization with a secular political party, and the two of them merge in order to control culture, you can have all the words you want to have for it. I've sometimes called them demagogic. I think that's true. Authoritarian, sure. But what they really are, biblically, philosophically, rhetorically, they are evil. And I make this case in my book, Good and Evil in the Garden of Democracy, where I try to demonstrate how evil exists in our culture, theologically, biblically, philosophically, rhetorically, and practically. It's everywhere we turn because the truth no longer matters. And the lie is at the top of the page, getting all the headlines, and no one cares about the lies. They accept the lies over there in that strange alternative universe we refer to as MAGA. I no longer capitalize MAGA because I think that it is such a low-brow movement that it only deserves the lowercase, MAGA lowercase across the board. But that's just me.
So, Rod, did you see this coming? Kind of this new dawn of this authoritism and Christian stuff and political stuff and whatever. If we took you back into even before 2000 and we took you in the 70s and 80s and 90s, you've been journeying for a while. Did you see this coming?
No, I can't take any credit for seeing it. I saw the encroachment of what I consider a runaway secular culture. And I saw that evangelicals and progressives should be on the same side in trying to figure out how to respond to a secular culture, but we've never been on the same side. And as secularism has taken over our culture, we are still fighting each other. So I did see that coming, and it's getting worse by the day. We are more at odds with one another now than we were in 1980. We now have trouble getting conservatives and liberals who once called each other brothers and sisters in the same church together because we see one another as enemies. I saw all of that developing in front of me. But I did not see the age of Trump coming. I did not see it.
Why has that been received from over half of this country in regards to the number of votes? If we look at that for a moment, just the general public.
Well, I think
Now, what's the vulnerability, if you will? Because you and I would say there's some kind of vulnerability there because we say it's a virus that somehow got into the system. And what's
so. First of all, it's always been there. It's always been there in every understanding of the word democracy. It's the word populism, and America has had outbursts of regional populism for almost from the beginning, and that populism has always had a wholly persecuted people who were fighting against the big interests, the big banks, the big railroads. So the farmers in Wisconsin and Kansas, the Calamity Howlers, all these populist movements came along. And then as we moved into the 1920s, Huey Long, the governor of Louisiana, was a full-blown populist. He was followed by George Wallace. But even at the height of his popularity, Wallace only attracted about 12% of the vote. So America has never had a national populist movement until Donald Trump figured out that people were angry and people were upset with the way the culture was going, and they created him. My first book was called The Immaculate Mistake, in which I document how the evangelicals over 100 years finally managed to create the perfect candidate, a bulldog that they could call God's anointed, that they could use to get what they want, which is control of everyone and everything. So they have successfully figured out how to stop losing and start winning. I believe that their winning is temporary and that it's going to come to a bad conclusion, but they are riding high right now. They are very giddy about all that they've been able to accomplish. But they have one fatal flaw. They do not know when they have enough. They keep pushing and pushing and pushing. So when they got rid of Roe, they are now going to try to get rid of gay marriage. They're doing everything they can to completely annihilate the transgender movement. They are trying to reinstitute very strict sexual and gender priorities in terms of what men and women can do. And they will keep pushing and pushing. And one day the American people will respond to it the way they responded to prohibition. They'll just say, we've had enough of this, and we will reclaim our dignity and our freedom, and the evangelicals will go back to the woods from which they came, just like their fundamentalist brothers did after the Scopes monkey trial. It's just a pattern.
I know about the Trump. Yeah.
It's populism. Trump is a man of deep emotions. They're superficial, but they are deep emotions. And he just says whatever's on his mind. He sounds like any guy sitting on a bale of hay in South Louisiana chewing tobacco, talking about how he could run this country better than anybody. Donald is one of those people. Now, how a billionaire from New York was able to influence Southerners so that the entire South is deep red, it is a mystery to me, as religious people like to say. But I would put populism at the top of that list.
Okay. Rod, if one of the things I'm thinking about as I listen to you is that based upon history, that this pattern, as you say, will correct itself in due time. And so if somebody were to say to you, well, don't get so upset about things, even as a progressive church, just ride this out and don't even be passionate about trying to turn it around. Don't do that to yourself and don't do that to others. Just kind of let it run its course. That's not what you're doing. And why is that not what you're doing? You're in your retirement years, Rod. You could just say, well, I'm just going to go fishing.
Right. Well, first of all, I don't like to fish unless the fish are biting. So okay. I'm not going fishing. And secondly, I think this message is too crucial. You see, it's a two-pronged thing. One, there's the dissent, but then there has to be the positive proclamation that helps people understand that progressive Christians are not the enemy. We're not of the devil. We take the Bible seriously, even if we don't take it literally. And I don't think that we're bold enough in presenting the positive contributions that progressive Christianity has made to this world. And it's not a matter of I do this because I'm opposed to MAGA. I am opposed, but that dissent is just a small part of my purpose in life. I continue to do this because I feel called to it and because I believe that what Christianity offers from the progressive side really is the gospel of Jesus Christ. I sometimes talk about the social gospel, but when I say social gospel, I just mean the gospel. The good news of Jesus is social. It involves real people and real lives with real struggles, and our responsibility to help them is off the charts. We cannot escape this. I don't care how many verses of scripture you might want to sling at me from the conservative side. Our job is to look after the people that God has put protected status on: the widow, the orphan, the immigrant, the poor. Right there, those four. I call that the gospel quadrilateral of need. That's our job, to sustain and protect the vulnerable. That's part of my calling.
Rod, maybe you've already covered this in some of what you've been saying here. What are three, and I'm sure there are more, but what are three major distinctives between a progressive Christian and a conservative Christian, or a liberal versus conservative, or fundamental? I mean, there's just so many words in both of those camps. What are three major distinctions?
So, first of all, the progressive faith has a gentler God. I find the fundamentalist God to be harsh and punitive, seemingly almost like the Greek and Roman gods of pagan mythology. And I find God on the progressive side to really be a God of mercy and justice, a God of compassion, and a God of love. I find it interesting that suddenly the evangelicals have awakened to the reality that they are opposed to the virtue of empathy. They're writing books and preaching sermons about how empathy is a vice and not a virtue. And I always go, this just doesn't make any sense to me. It fails to compute. So the first distinction is the nature of God. And the progressive Christians have a God based on the Bible, based on God's reaching out to Abraham and creating a people and having a covenant and building a house that shall be a place of prayer for all people. The second distinction between these two groups is that conservative, fundamentalist evangelicals make a list of doctrines that are infallible and inerrant, and you cannot be a Christian if you do not adhere to all of them. So over the years, I've taken a look at that list of fundamentalist doctrines with which they started this movement in the late 19th century, and I find it very difficult to embrace any of them. So we are not a people based on a list of doctrines. We're a people based on how are we going to meet all this human need in the name of Jesus. And I think the third big distinction between progressives and fundamentalists is that the progressive mind is more open to other expressions of faith, not going around insisting that not only are we Christians, we're the only Christians, but we are people of interfaith. And the key in that word is faith, people of faith. And I believe that when Jesus said that he was the way, the truth, and the life, he wasn't talking about a form of the church. He was talking about a way of life. And that anyone that embraces a life of suffering sacrifice is walking in the way of Jesus, even if they give it a different name from that. So that opens us to a broader, more egalitarian understanding that all kinds of people can have faith. And it also bumps me into the fact that I have agnostic and atheistic friends who in their humanity are more Christ-like than some of my former evangelical brothers and sisters.
Yes. So Rod, let's put a thought experiment out there for a minute. Let's say you live in Baton Rouge right now.
Right.
That's your home. So we'll not use Baton Rouge, even though it might apply in some ways. Let's use some little town somewhere in some state. It doesn't have to be in the South, but I kind of want to pick it in the South, but maybe not. And you're a progressive Christian, and you live in town. You're Rod Kennedy. Everything's equal. But there's not a progressive church in town. There's a few conservative fundamentalist churches, and and that's just about it because it's a small town. But somehow a progressive church has never been planted there. It doesn't have a history there. And you meet your neighbor, and your neighbor says that they want to go to church. And somehow they learn about you as a man of faith, and they assume you go to church. And let's say that you've decided, and I want you to tell me in that thought experiment, would you go to church if there was not a progressive church to go to? It wasn't within driving distance. And if your neighbor said, well, I want to go to church. I've got a spiritual hunger. You know, my grandmother gave me a Bible when I was whatever, and I want to go to this really fundamentalist church, and they don't know what it is. Would you say to them, I don't think you should go. Maybe you should just come over to my house and we'll just have coffee. I mean, what would you recommend to that person?
Yes, I would go to church. I would invite them to church. When I can't stomach the theology of a fundamentalist community, I look for a church that has a strong, deep commitment to liturgy. So that means if there's an Episcopal church there, that's where I'll go to church, because there I'm going to hear the weekly readings of Scripture, I'm going to hear a sermon, and I'm going to receive the sacrament of Holy Communion. If the only liturgical church in town was a Roman Catholic church, I would go to the Catholic Church. And I would not imbibe the parts of that theology that I find untenable, but I could worship there in peace, because that's where the Word of God is being proclaimed and where the sacrament is being administered. But my basic concern is to say to people who are not really that big on church anymore is that the church matters. It matters because it's always mattered. And I have discovered that God continues to use small, patriarchal, fundamentalist church to produce people that are just as weird as I am. Because one of those churches produced me. And that church would probably want to take back my ordination certificate today if they had any idea that I was saying what I'm saying to you. But it's too late for that. That ship has sailed. They ordained me. They gave me a Bible. They told me to read it and figure out what it said and then tell people. So I'm doing what they told me to do. And I've been doing it as faithfully as possible for 64 years. So yes, church matters. As a matter of fact, it's a part of my message to a secular culture. I know that people are out of the habit of going to church. I know that they think that church is nothing but a show and that it's full of hypocrites. I know a lot of the reasons they don't go. Some people have been seriously hurt by the church. Hell, I've been hurt by the church, but I would never leave it. I would never leave it, because God promises to show up there no matter how badly we are acting. And so I keep encouraging people.
And Rod, what about
come back to church, because they need to come home.
What about the person who says? What about the person who says we're having a little bit of delay in the Wi-Fi, but hey, that's just the day and age we're in. You're in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and I'm in McMinnville, Oregon, and so it's amazing and
it's raining cats and dogs.
It's raining a lot, but we've had about 4 or 5 really beautiful dry days, but then it started again. But you know what? It's fall and winter. Where was I before here?
Well, we're talking about how much the church matters.
Yeah, church matters. And what about the person who has a real seasoned journey in and out of church, or maybe in church for so long? And I'm 67 years old. And Rod, do you mind sharing? You're in your what, 70s?
Yes.
I think you told me that. Okay.
Yeah.
So the person says, and I've got friends that have been on this road, and I was on this road not too long ago. I've come back to church. And actually, I can say whatever home means to me, I can say I've come back home. But what about the person who says, I don't need church? And I don't even watch it on television. I have a group of people that I meet with, and we do civic type of things, and we serve in the community and whatever. And I'm just done with church. Is there something lacking in that? If we just say, well, God is everywhere and God's church is everywhere. I mean, this is the way I often think. But what about the person who goes, I don't need it because it is not even that I was hurt so much in that space. I mean, that's one way to understand why they wouldn't return to an abusive place, and many possibly a string of abusive churches. What about the person who just says, I find it just to be non-important to me? What does Rod say to that?
Well, first of all, I think it's important for the church. I think the church has to admit that we didn't always tell people the complete truth about what life is like outside the church. We kept insisting that if you were outside the church, you could not flourish. But there are plenty of people right now who will tell you that they are living full, flourishing lives with no faith relationship to any congregation anywhere in the world.
That's what I'm getting at.
Right. We should own up to the fact that secular humanism is a powerful draw to people. But we also need to remind them that what they're depending on to get them by ultimately becomes a matter of gritting their teeth, doing the best they can, and not having anybody else to hang on to when the going gets really difficult. And one thing church does for me is that it really comes to my aid in the storms and the difficult times. I think that in good times, affluent times, we've got enough money and we've got a portfolio and we've got a retirement and we've got investments and we've got our family. In good times, I can see how people would say, I got better things to do on Sunday. And I would accept that person telling me that as the truth. And I would say to them, I would just like for us to stay in conversation because I think that there are things that church can accomplish and do for you that you're overlooking or that you've never experienced before. And no matter how difficult it may seem, I'm convinced that the church still matters. And I just hope that that person would continue to be in conversation with me. I would try to develop a relationship because I think it's important. It's critical for persons to come back to church or to come for the very first time. And I've had some success in helping agnostics find a relationship in church. And sometimes their agnosticism doesn't really change a lot. But then again, there are more agnostics in church than we like to admit because the church is not really up to speed in what it takes to really produce faithful disciples of Jesus in a culture that has become as nationalistic and hyper patriotic as ours.
Rod, what does it take when we're talking about, and the word discipleship? Wow, that's a trigger word for a lot of folks, man. It was a trigger word for me because of some of my early experience. I didn't grow up in a Christian family, and then when I had my conversion experience and then I began to be discipled, I found some real problems with it. So I've been able to work with that and kind of get beyond that. You said that the church has kind of lost its way in regards to, we'll call it discipleship. What is lost? What can the church do in regards to, and I assume it's part of what you're passionate about is not just come back to a building, if you will, where people sit, but there's something that happens in that space or can happen in that space that's critical to being a follower of Jesus. What are those things?
So I think first of all, it's like incorporating the Jewish concept that a righteous person is a person that's going to commit themselves to rebuilding our world one tiny little bit at a time by serving human need and by offering people sheer goodness, attention, space, the ability to be there for them, to be in relationship with them. Discipleship is not a matter of checking off these boxes that I attend regularly, that I'm a tither, that I read my Bible. That's just legalism. That has no relationship to discipleship. Discipleship has to do with my willingness to suffer on behalf of people I may not even know, that I might lift them up a little bit, one little tiny incremental thing at a time. And that if I am faithful to that, then I am being a disciple of Jesus Christ. And it's not a matter, well, did you go to church every Sunday this month? I don't know. Maybe I did, maybe I didn't. I don't really think that's the issue. The issue is whether or not I'm going to take seriously what it means to figure out how I, as a human being, can be the incarnation of Jesus Christ in the world. If I can do that, I'm a faithful disciple. I put a lot of stock in Matthew 25. I put a lot of stock in feeding and healing and providing and sustaining and encouraging other human beings. If I'm doing that, I'm a disciple. I put no stock in judging, condemning, and making a list of things that I believe are sinful and disgusting to God. That's just not my business. My business is people. I say all the time, we've got all this human need and we have Jesus. Now, what can we do to show Jesus to all these hurting people and actually help them? That's what I mean by discipleship. And I keep using that word, just like I keep claiming to be an evangelical. But I don't mean evangelical in its 21st century political nationalistic sense. I mean it in its first century sense, its New Testament sense. that it's like Jesus and what Jesus did for everybody. I don't think he ever met a human being in need that he didn't respond to. Now that's discipleship.
Okay.
If you cross my path and you have a need, something in me is going to try to respond to help you with that need. I'm not just going to tell you to leave me alone and go away, because I think you crossed my path and that it's my job to do what I can to put you in a good direction or to help you in some physical, material way. Christianity is physical, material, it's bodily. I am sick and tired of Gnosticism. Gnosticism makes everything so spiritual. Don't tell me that. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in incarnation. That's what Jesus was, an actual, real, fleshly human being, going about doing everything he could to meet every need that he met. And I am part of that. I'm part of that long line. I'm proud to be part of that.
Rod, what has happened to, based upon some of your earlier comments, what's happened to the progressive church? What we might even say has become a bit of a sleeping giant. What's happened and what needs to happen in a church, a progressive church that's a little too, I don't know if it's the right language to use, a little too sleepy?
Okay, so one thing I think is that I think the progressive church, in an attempt to make sure that no one ever mistakes us for a right-wing fundamentalist, is that we've thrown away too much stuff that we should still be using. For example, I insist right up front every week on my sermon that I put on my YouTube channel that I take the Bible seriously. And sometimes the progressive message seems almost embarrassed by the Bible. Now, there's no
Say that
doubt.
again, Rod. Rod, say that again because we had a little bit of a delay there about the Bible and
Sometimes
the way it's taken.
the progressive church sometimes seems almost embarrassed by the Bible because honestly, there's a lot of embarrassing stuff in the book. Stuff that you wouldn't want to adhere to, stuff that we do not believe, stuff we're not required to believe. But I think that it is a mistake for the progressive church to wean itself from the clear teaching of Scripture because the progressive message is right there in Scripture. I can show it to people from Genesis to Revelation, even in the book of Leviticus. Leviticus says that the alien who lives in your midst is your neighbor, and you should love them as you love yourself. You can't get more serious than that. And oh, by the way, we're talking about immigration now. And I don't know that the progressive church is going back and rooting its politics in Scripture. And that's where we have to go. You know, I have all the respect in the world for the Old Testament scholarship of Walter Brueggemann. And Brueggemann said, you know, the Bible, we have to root our lives in what this book says. And that means our preachers have got to be well versed in it and they have to know how to preach it. But here's another thing that bothers me. I don't see preaching getting the major emphasis in progressive churches that it needs. You know, like if all these publications every year, they make a list of the best books of 2025 and they have all these categories. And I just noticed yesterday in a review of those, they no longer have a list of the best preaching books of 2025. And publishers are not publishing very many preaching textbooks. Seminaries only require their students to take one introductory course to preaching. That's a 3-hour course in which you get the basics, and then they ordain you and they send you out to preach. And I'm telling you, you're not ready for that. You are not prepared to preach. Preaching is a difficult craft to learn. And I'm afraid the progressive church is letting too much go by the wayside that's critical. Preaching, the Bible, our commitment to what we mean by the word salvation, and not making it about pie in the sky by and by, but making it about what we're doing here and now. And I think the progressive church should stop being embarrassed by our vocabulary and start reclaiming some of those words. The evangelicals do not own those words. They are just hijacking them. And that means our task, rhetorically, our task is to give new meanings to old words. And it is a difficult but exacting task. And I give myself to it every single day. And it helps me maintain my focus. It gives me a foundation on which to stand. And as you can tell, I can get pretty fired up about this.
Yes, you can, and I can feel it. I can feel it. And that's good. So, Rod, I'm thinking as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking about the fundamentalist conservative church, this kind of a new church, as the bully. And then I'm thinking that, and I'm hearing you, I'm putting it in that space of bully and who's getting bullied. And I'm thinking the progressive church needs to stand up to the bully, not by being aggressive toward the bully, but by taking ownership of actually what the truth is.
Right.
And I can say that now, that we've allowed them to take ownership of the very sacred things that the progressive church stands on, but needs to be more active in. And so, what is the Sunday morning service important, Rod? Because you preach and you have a YouTube channel, and later we'll give folks a way to find that. But I think you told me when we talked that that's not always you inside of a church preaching to a congregation. How important is a Sunday service to the life of a given church? How important is
Well,
that?
so I would piggyback on my previous statement about how much church matters by saying that preaching still matters. And at the
Yeah.
place where you make sure it matters, that responsibility belongs to the preacher. And so I don't think a preacher can spend an hour on Friday and pull something together that they think is cute and schmaltzy and entertaining and write it on a piece of paper, type it out and use it as a manuscript and call that a sermon. It's a speech. Too much preaching sounds like TED Talks, okay?
Interesting.
So I assigned myself the task of finding the list of the 100 largest churches in America, going to their web pages one at a time, clicking on their weekly sermons, looking at the titles, listening to the sermons, and I find an excessive preoccupation with self-help, positive thinking. It's all about anthropology. It's not about theology. It's not God-centered, it's human-centered. It's about how you can be wealthy and healthy. It's about how you can be successful. It's about how to make it in the world. And the Christian gospel gets lost in that. And I think the progressive voice has gotten lost in this secular world. How many preachers do we have who every week seriously struggle with the meaning of those lectionary texts that they are supposed to be preaching on Sunday morning? Now, there are a lot of them who are doing it, but people don't know who they are. I have discovered a lot of great preaching in this country, and people are still showing up. People still show up to hear a preacher who takes advantage of all the resources we have. I mean, we progressives have the advantage of 200 years of the most unbelievable, fantastic biblical scholarship.
It's so true, Rod.
And our preachers are not taking advantage of that scholarship. I listen to those sermons and I hear cute stories and I hear moving testimonials. I hear way too much about the preacher's personal life, but I am not hearing our preachers take full advantage of the sheer gift of the volume of scholarship that's available to help people understand what the New Testament says and that it's not what the fundamentalists think it says. I'll give you one quick example.
Please do, Rod.
So there's a text where it says that two people will be working in the field and one shall be left and one shall be taken. Now, fundamentalists and evangelicals have turned this into this fantastical idea of something called the rapture, okay? So just a minimum of checking on the meaning of that text historically, you will discover that Jesus is using this as a parable, and he's talking about something that happened regularly in the first century, is that you'll be out in the field working, and you look up, and here comes, galloping down the road towards your village, a bunch of marauders, and they are going to burn your village and capture your women, and one will be taken and one will be left, and then they're going to move on. It has absolutely nothing to do with anything as stupid as the rapture. It has to do with real human life. And I don't think progressives are spending enough time figuring out what that means. You know, I taught preaching at the seminary for 15 years, and I would try to make my students read the church fathers and mothers. I would insist that they find at least one decent commentary that they would commit to reading through. I'm a big fan of the Anchor Bible. I think some of the best work in New Testament scholarship has been done there. I keep reading Marcus Barth's 2 volumes on Ephesians because it just thrills my heart to see someone who has helped us unpack what it means to be the church in our day and time. And Marcus Barth does a fine job of that. I can never get enough of Raymond Brown and his huge 2 volumes on the Gospel of John, where he talks about the sacrament. Sometimes the bread of life is the word that is preached, and sometimes the bread of life is the sacrament that's given to the people. It's just too good. It's too good to leave it on a shelf. I don't know. I keep encouraging my students to read more, study harder, preach better. We cannot sacrifice the truth by being unprepared, inept, inexperienced, and uneducated. The first 4 centuries of the church was dominated by the most intelligent, best educated people in the ancient world. These are people who were gigantic rhetorical scholars. They were converted to Christianity, and they brought all that intellectual firepower into their pulpit. And that's what grew the church. The church was not grown by a bunch of backcountry hicks who were just talking out the top of their head. It became the church because it paid attention to its scholarship. And people will think, oh my God, an elitist. I'm okay with that. You can call me whatever you want to. What I'm asking to do is look at the evidence. And the evidence suggests that a church that is intelligent and serious and committed and passionate can still reach people. That's the kind of church I like to be a part of.
Gosh, I've got 6 questions that are or more that are jumbling around in my brain.
That's okay.
Yeah, tough to manage. So, Rod, what if that's what the progressive church was doing, and as you say, this just incredible amount of scholarship, and there was a time when that was the word of the day, if you will.
Right.
What interrupted that? And I know I'm sure that there's multiple variables to what, but what is there 1 or 2 primary, like secularism? I mean, what interrupted that to where all of a sudden the progressive church has fallen so far behind? And as you say, you can even go listen to those services and those messages, and you're left to want and go, what in the world happened to your legacy? How did this come about? What's the diagnosis there? Because I think if we don't get that diagnosis, sometimes I hear a lot of things, and I'm not saying you're doing this, but I hear other things a lot about, well, here's the treatment. But it's like, well, do we have the diagnosis down? How did that happen?
In America,
In
America, it's the religious version of populism. It's the anti-intellectual, keep it simple, stupid preaching. It was the evangelical attempt to win as many souls as possible without paying any attention to development. Revivalism. Revivalism is one of American Christianity's greatest vices. Revivalism gave birth to more unbelievable, outrageous religious movements than we can begin to count.
And unpack that just a little bit for me and even people listening. What is revivalism, and name a few?
So when Finney was in the business of preaching all these revival meetings from place to place in upstate New York, it's now known as the burned over district, because from this revivalism, this excessive emotionalism, this total emphasis on trust Jesus and get saved that continued all the way through Billy Graham. Even Franklin is on national television these days trying to get people to pray the sinner's prayer. That's revivalism. Billy Sunday, Dwight Moody, even Jerry Falwell, but in that burned over district came Jehovah's Witnesses, the Latter-day Saints, the sisters who believed in seances, just a lot of strange movements come up, bubbling up out of the cauldron of revivalism. And revivalism is not church-centered. And so it took away from the idea that you needed to be connected to a body of Christ. If you just got saved and you're going to go to heaven, then what the hell? You do whatever you want to all the rest of your life. So populism combined with revivalism led America down an anti-intellectual trail. And it was ripe for demagogues to take advantage. And by the 1970s, it culminated in televangelism. And those televangelists have promised to make people wealthy while enriching only themselves. And they turn Christianity into a clown show where the preacher can get on TV and say, I really need an $80 million jet, and I want you to send me the money to buy one because my ministry really needs this. And this is what God wants me to have. I'm sorry, but that is just organized BS. But people fall for it. One of my rhetorical scholar friends says that Americans are always attracted to humbuggery. It's just something in our DNA.
Okay.
We
There's
love
a diagnosis.
we
There's a
love
diagnosis.
P.T. Barnum. And I'm telling you that some portion of American religion is just another version of P.T. Barnum's greatest show on earth.
Okay.
That's part of my diagnosis.
Okay. That's good.
The other part is that fundamentalists began to react to the scholarship of the modernist liberal congregations, and they became hypercritical of it. And their sermons are still filled with all of this disgust and disdain about what all these awful radical liberals are saying.
Yes.
And they begin to hammer away at the intellectual foundations of our faith. And we've allowed them to do it with very little kickback. Where's Harry Fosdick when we need him?
Yeah, I know that name.
So Fosdick preached a sermon entitled, Shall the Fundamentalist Win? And he concluded, no. And he was right, because he helped defeat them by showing that what they believed was inadequate and that what progressive Christianity taught was positive, uplifting, and real. And he's hard to find now in our pulpit.
Rod, I took a few notes. I bet we've covered how do we disengage the church from secular politics?
So, simple answer is that the church has to recover its prophetic critique of secular politics. Instead of lining up with our hands out, looking for political power and money, we have to reclaim our calling that we are to critique the secular world, both in its liberal and in its conservative, because we cannot afford to forget that secularism is both conservative and liberal, and neither of those are always Christian. Sometimes both of them are much less than Christian. So Dr. Carl Menninger once said that you Christian preachers need to recover your Amos, your inner Amos, the ability to say, this is not right. And you cannot do this. And I believe it takes a lot of courage to do that. And we've got to be willing to not just critique issues that are important to me, cultural issues that matter to me, but we have to be willing to critique the entire culture, especially the secular political clown show that's going on in our country today. I mean, I'm not only concerned about the future of the church right now, I'm concerned about the future of democracy. It looks like Americans, by maybe 40%, are willing to ditch democracy in favor of one authoritarian ruler who simply tells everybody what they can and cannot do. Okay, you can't be more anti-American than that. So I have a deep affinity for being pro-democracy and pro-church. But I don't think the two can ever combine with one another, because I think it's only the prophetic imagination that keeps the church alive, even when it looks like it's dying. And by the way, this is especially true of the African American prophetic imagination, because I think the African American prophets have had more to say to critique our culture than all the rest of us put together. And I find a lot of meaning by reading the African American poets, novelists, preachers, and prophets.
Do you have some current names, Rod? Because a lot
Cornel
of those,
West, you can't get more controversial than Cornel West.
Well,
And
that's
I
true.
would say that it's important to be conversant with the African American historians who are writing about democracy. One of the best books I read in the last few years is called Democracy in Black, by a Princeton University professor. He's now a regular contributor to CNN, and I keep looking. And Cornel West reminds us that Black prophetic tradition, which goes all the way back to Frederick Douglass and keeps moving forward into the 21st century, is something that needs to inhabit our lives. So I try to teach my mostly white students how they can preach in the African American tradition that is prophetic. I'm not talking delivery stuff here. I'm talking about intellectual and spiritual, how you can use that prophetic imagination to make your sermons more powerful. Because ultimately, the preaching needs to be powerful that comes from our pulpits. And it doesn't need to be preaching that condemns or preaching that makes people just feel bad. Because I've discovered that you can make people feel so bad, they feel like they've paid their penance and they go to lunch and completely forget what you said. They don't feel the need to do anything else because you just got through beating the hell out of them. That's not effective.
They paid their dues at church.
That's right.
Yeah. Oh, goodness. Rod, what does the cross of Jesus Christ mean to you?
It's a complex question in a Christian age where the cross is disappearing from big churches, for example. Like a megachurch pastor told the architect about to put his new church together, whatever you do, don't put any crosses in this building because it's a sign of weakness and failure. And we don't want anything but success around here. So, what I think is that the word cross is a pregnant metaphor for everything that it means to be a follower of Jesus Christ and to remind me of how inadequate I am at bearing my cross, which I think comes down to suffering, sacrificial love on behalf of the others, all the others. Those ones I mentioned earlier, the widows, the orphans, single mothers, the people who feel they're persecuted, the immigrants, the poor, and enmeshing ourselves in what Walter Rauschenbusch deemed the social gospel to try to make a difference in the lives of people who are hurting. And I believe that living out that cross can be incredibly painful. Harry Emerson Fosdick, for example, suffered a mental breakdown for the time that he spent in ministry in Hell's Kitchen while he was a seminary student at Union Seminary. Charles Spurgeon, considered one of the world's greatest preachers, suffered from mental exhaustion and depression that made him go away to France for 3 months at a time just for recovery because the cross has to be preached. You know, Fred Craddock is one of my favorite preachers.
Yes, I've
And
got his book.
yeah, and Fred said, I must preach the cross because it is what it is. It's the message that God has given us. And I'm not talking about how fundamentalists go into all the gory details of the physical suffering of Jesus. You know, I grew up with that. When my preacher at home would run out of something to say, he would make a beeline to the cross and then he'd spend 20 minutes describing all of the anguish and suffering and the blood and the guts and the swords and the nails. And you would just sit there until you were just emotionally exhausted. And you would go, oh my God, I've heard this before. If I ever hear another bloody sermon, I'm going to shoot myself. I'm
Yeah.
not talking, that's not what I'm talking about. It's a metaphor, but we're the ones who have to incarnate it. Okay. And I don't believe that Jesus is calling me to go hang on a cross somewhere. If he is, he's only going to want me to do it one time. As a young preacher, I had a simple rule. I'm willing to go to the cross, but I'm not going there every week at every business meeting. There are some issues where I'm just not going to come down one way or the other. You guys are just going to have to slug it out. Okay. So cross, complicated word. A lot of Christians uncomfortable with it. They don't want to hear it. But I'm saying we have to be willing to deal with it. It also means I don't think you have to have an atonement theory. You know, when I went to seminary, you had to pick out an atonement theory. You had to go for it. Are you a substitutionary atonement guy? Are you a ransom theory guy? Are you a moral influence guy? You had to have a theory or you couldn't graduate. I don't care about theories. I don't. I'm talking about humanity here. I'm interested in what you're going to do to show people that you are a Christian by the way you respond to them and relate to them and help them. You know, if someone said to me, tell me, what is a Christian anyway? I would have simply pointed to my own father. His name is Jeff Davis Kennedy. And yes, he was named for the president of the Confederacy. We grew up in the hills of North Louisiana. But my father, to me, my dad, was the definition of a Christian. The man lived a quiet, humble, faithful life in which he helped every member of our community in every way that he possibly can for as long as he lived his 91 years. And he, to me, was the definition of a Christian, incarnate, human.
Yes. I'm always very interested, and we don't have time today, but I'm always interested in somebody like your father. It's like, what made him who he was? What choices did he make, to suffer? But that may be maybe for another time. Rod, as you were talking about the cross, it reminded me of what Malcolm Muggeridge said. What a symbol for a movement, cross.
Right.
What an absurd symbol for a movement.
Right.
To ever adopt. And then I'm thinking of, I attended when I graduated from college, I taught agriculture for a few years down in Central Florida. And I went to a little Baptist church, and it was fundamentalist, man. I mean, I'm sure you've heard of that movement somewhere in Indiana. I think something like the Sword of the Lord or something.
Yes, I grew up with the Sword of the Lord. It came to my house every Friday. It was a magazine.
Was a publication.
It was a publication.
All right. Okay. Well,
Harold Smith.
Okay. Well, the kind of church I was attending, and there was about 30 of us that were there. Church is still there. But I'll never forget, and I've heard a lot of sermons, and I've studied the Bible, and I've heard a lot of Bible messages, if you will. I'll never forget when Pastor David was describing something about the cross, and he said, I imagine Jesus in heaven with nail prints still. Something about that really became very important. And that somehow Jesus wasn't, whatever the resurrection is, and taken up and then a new body and everything, but Jesus will for eternally. And I don't even think it's some kind of a theological thing I'm presenting, but to me, it deepened my fidelity to a God who was changed forever. It was changed forever. That the cross changed him forever. It wasn't just an episode that he got over, but that God was wounded forever. And I just went, man, something about that welcomes me into the place with my wounds on an ongoing basis, because God has been wounded and didn't change that. If we think of an all-powerful God that could change that and all of a sudden be good again, good meaning not having a disfigured body. And I remember that, and it was just a little sliver of a sermon. I don't remember one other thing he ever said. So it's interesting the things we remember, isn't it? Something that speaks to us. And that was in a sermon, man. And boy, I tell you what, could he preach, man. Well, Rod, what else we want to talk about before we say goodbye to one another today? Anything else that you want to
Well, I just want to piggyback on it. I tell people sometimes that the sword of the Lord made me liberal.
Well,
and then I just leave them to try to figure out what that meant.
What that meant. That was really interesting a few minutes ago when we did that, what we'll call maybe a thought experiment. And that, well, maybe let's finish it out with this. You said if there was a liturgical church available and there wasn't a progressive, be it like the church I attend is a progressive American Baptist church here in McMinnville. And there's liturgical churches here. But Rob, what if you were in the community and there weren't liturgical churches within driving distance, and the only thing that was in town was 4 or 5 fundamentalist churches that were on the corner of some street corner, and your neighbor said, would you take me to church? And do you go to church there, Rod? Because I, for some reason, want to go back to church or go to church for the first time. Would you be attending to that church, and would you take your neighbor there?
That's a really hard question for me to answer.
I know.
Given my commitment to church, I would find it very difficult to abandon church.
I think that's what I'm getting at, Rod.
Right. And in whatever form it takes, I am convinced that God still uses churches like that somehow to make a difference in human lives. So on the one hand, I would say, yes, I would go to that church and I'd volunteer to teach Sunday school.
You'd slip in.
That would cause trouble and get me disinvited. So
and then you'd have to just go to the next one, wouldn't you?
And it would no longer be my problem. I would go, but I could not be. I would go.
You couldn't be silent.
No. Like I walked out of a funeral once in 2016 in which the preacher in the funeral sermon made an appeal literally for people to vote for Donald Trump. And I said to him as I walked out, Reverend, I thought that was the most disrespectful and unchristian thing I've ever heard in a pulpit. And I know that you belong to denomination and that you have a bishop. And I feel a need to pick up my phone and call your bishop and tell him that you just made a complete ass out of yourself. And he didn't see that coming, so he didn't have a very good response. And I did not call his bishop. I'm not vindictive. But I was really embarrassed for all of us by that. But I could not be silent. I don't have the capacity for silence. I couldn't sit there and bear that. I grew up with it. I spent 20 years doing that. I'm done with that. There'd have to be a progressive church somewhere. I'd drive as far as it takes.
I was going to say you'd get there. You'd get there because if you went to those 5 conservative or fundamentalist churches, you'd get kicked out of every one of them because you couldn't be silent. So when your neighbor said, "Hey, would you take me?" you'd say, "Well, you know what? There's a restraining order. They won't let me in." Right?
Yeah.
But you might want to go, and then you can come back and tell me, and then maybe we can talk.
There you go. That's possible.
I like it, Rod. I like it a lot. Rod, where can people find your books? Where can they find your videos? I mean, where do we find this wild-eyed Louisiana preacher?
So it's www.theprogressivepreacher.com. Okay. And you have to put the in there. I spent 13 years in Ohio, and Ohio State University refers to itself as the Ohio State University.
Yeah,
that's where I picked up the habit of saying that I am the progressive preacher.
Kennedy.
Right.
Rod, do you, back in the days when pastors would do that circuit preaching by horseback, do you travel the country? Like if you get an invitation to 5 states over from Louisiana, do you go or would you come if somebody invited you?
Like, yeah, I just had a trip to the Catskills in upstate New York to do a presentation on my new preaching book, Dancing with Metaphors in the Pulpit. And so I've been in 44 states, and I have done over 3,500 presentations since 1997. So if I'm invited, I figure out a way that I can work that out, and I go wherever I'm invited to go. I have fewer invitations to preach since 2016 as we've become a more polarized country. I become radical even in progressive circles. And I find that hurtful, and actually, because my message hasn't changed, and I think I have a message that progressive churches need to hear, and I'm willing to spread it as best I can. And I'm always open to those invitations. I'll pretty much go anywhere to have the opportunity to speak a good word.
That's good, Rod. Rod, I want to thank you. This has been rich.
Thank you, Doug. It's been wonderful.
Really rich. Would you come back to From the Belly?
Sure. Just let me know when. I love talking.
I want to have you back to do another episode, just the two of us. And we've done in the past, kind of our first go at this 4 or 5 years ago. And then we wrapped it up after COVID. We just got kind of worn out and didn't have any more money to do the editing that's required. People have told me that I need to start asking for donations. I heard of an interesting one. Rod, if you're the one that told me this, tell me. But if not, somebody said, because I might have been complaining a little bit and saying, well, you know, the editing thing, and I don't pay a lot of money to even have this recording set up and whatever. I would like to take this to the next level, but I don't have the funding for it. And he said, you know, Doug, I was listening to a podcast the other day, and the individual said, we take anywhere between $1 and $10. We will not take any more than $10. So don't send me anything more than. Was that you, Rod?
Yeah, I told you that.
Man, that was.
I like to tell people that.
That was choice,
I'm
Rod.
not looking for a private jet, and I don't want a Lamborghini, and I have a house to live in. But if you'd help me spread this message,
that's right.
Send me $1 up, but don't send me more than $10. It will be refunded.
Rod, is it okay if I adopt that?
Sure, I think it's a great strategy. I call it
I loved it, man.
It's the anti-televangelist appeal.
If you send me $11, there's $1 coming back at you.
Yep.
I like it a lot.
That's great, man.
Thank you, and I'm glad that I mentioned that because you're the one that did it. Rod, thank you very, very much. Grateful that you're doing this work. Grateful that you're doing this work. I've learned so much.
Go talk somebody into inviting me to come see you personally. Then we can talk all you want.
Rod, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it, Rod.
All right. That'll be a
Um,
deal.
That'll be a deal. Stay with me while I hit the stop button because everything needs to load up. So don't leave yet.
Okay.
And then you and I will chat for a little bit more. Folks, thank you so much for listening. I know the folks that listen to this, and I know it's really, really been a gift. So, Rod, thank you. And I'm going to hit the stop button.